We have to take the gloves off. Americans pushing Republicans really hard, particularly when they try to defend Trump, but Americans also really pushing their Democratic members of Congress to do more, to fight harder against this White House and what feels like a real crisis in Washington. And that's happening not just to Democratic members of Congress you're learning about for the first time here, because I'm showing you tape from their town hall. It's happening to all the Democrats, including the Democratic leader in Washington, Hakeem Jeffries, leader of the House. This was outside his office in Brooklyn, New York on Thursday. Hundreds of people calling on him to be more aggressive toward this White House, to stand up faster, to stand up more firmly, to fight harder against Trump and his top campaign donor. It happened to Leader Jeffries again the very next day in Oakland, California. This was outside an event where Congressman Jeffries was giving remarks. Hundreds of people gathered outside demanding that he do more. And I absolutely understand the sentiment, but what can he do? What does he believe is within his power? Joining us now is the man himself, Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries. The case that you are making against Republican policies here is one that I hear and is cogent and that plays to a greater or lesser extent, I think, all across this country. The other thing that Americans are stressed out about, though, right now, is that policy doesn't feel like it's the main conversation right now. It feels like we are in the middle of a ketamine-fueled, middle-of-the-night, autocratic power grab that is rendering Congress irrelevant, that's rendering policy irrelevant, and that's rendering the rule of law an afterthought, if not a joke, to those who are planning on staying in power indefinitely without benefit of further elections. I mean, it is not about it is about a bad budget. That's one of the things you have to contend with. But the fight here feels like it's on a different scale than the kinds of legislative point-counterpoint stuff that I think Democrats and Republicans are used to fighting over. And I think what Americans are sort of clamoring for is to hear from you personally, as the senior Democrat in Washington, in the House where the margins are so narrow, to hear from you that you understand the scale of the threat and you have ideas about how to interrupt what feels like something that we have not experienced since the Civil War in terms of the threat to our republic.
Well, it's certainly the case that we understand the scale of the threat. That can't be doubted. The CBC, which I'm a part of, definitively understands the scale of the threat. Our communities have been under siege, as you pointed out, since before the Civil War. I'm a direct descendant of those very communities, so we understand the struggle, the history, the strength of people like John Lewis, which we're going to channel. That's my experience. That's my personal experience. That's my family's experience. And so we understand that. And as a caucus, it's definitively the case that we understand that. Listen, we launched the Rapid Response Task Force and Litigation Working Group. It's going to be led by Joe Neguse and, of course, a brilliant constitutional lawyer, Jamie Raskin, to be able to respond to and work with our allies, like Tish James and others, in part of what we are responding to. Listen, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, they're flooding the zone in part to create distress, to create a sense of invincibility and inevitability. But the reality is, there have been more than 75 different lawsuits that have been filed by democracy reform groups, civil rights reform groups, by attorney generals like Tish James and others. And we're winning in court. They're losing. More than 35 different unconstitutional and unlawful executive orders and administrative actions have been challenged. And they're not winning those cases in terms of the Trump administration. They're losing over and over and over again. That's been a forceful pushback. And that, of course, will continue. The congressional battles will continue. And the mobilization in the communities will continue.
Does it help? Does it advance Democrats' ability to stand up against Trump and Musk and what's happening in Washington, to have people at these town halls, to have people protesting in various symbolic and important places, either that represent the government or that represent some of the forces that are at work right now within our government? Does people showing up and doing direct action, peaceful, nonviolent direct action, to try to put steel in your spine, among others, does it help, or is it more of a hindrance to you?
Well, listen, public sentiment is everything, as Abraham Lincoln once said. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. I don't think anyone needs additional steel put in their spine. Let's be clear about that. And I think, the House Democrats under the leadership of Nancy Pelosi during the prior Trump administration, continuing to where we are at this moment, are going to continue to push back forcefully, using every tool available. Now, I think it does help, for instance, that our House Republican colleagues are held accountable. Rachel, you appropriately mentioned we've got the narrowest majority that any party has had in the Congress since before the Great Depression. Narrowest majority. 218 Republicans, 215 Democrats. The Democrats are holding together. We're holding together, for instance, on this reckless Republican budget, which is a betrayal of working class Americans, and cuts to Medicaid, cuts to SNAP, cuts to veterans benefits. That's not theoretical. That hurts real people that I represent and that every single member of the House Democratic Caucus represents. That's not a theoretical fight. That's a real fight. But here's the thing. On any given issue like the budget, we only need 3. Not all 218 Republicans. We only need 3 to do the right thing for their constituents. And so the activity that we've seen over the last few days, over the last week or so, I think is going to let the Republicans know that no one is going to remove the spotlight from them. They shouldn't be able to escape accountability. And as Democrats, we're going to make sure that they don't.
Democratic leader in the House, Hakeem Jeffries. Leader Jeffries, it is a real honor to have you here. I know that your time is valuable. Come back anytime, sir. I'd love to talk to you anytime you can stand it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, Donald Trump made history today, and so today became a day that will live in infamy in presidential history, because today Donald Trump formally rejected the position that every American president has held since Franklin Delano Roosevelt masterminded the American victory in World War II. Leader of the free world. That is what Franklin Roosevelt turned the job of the presidency into during World War II. Every subsequent president until Donald Trump fulfilled that role, especially at the United Nations. The United Nations began in the imagination of President Roosevelt. While President Roosevelt was making the key strategic decisions leading to victory in World War II, he was also planning the aftermath of the war. He was planning the peace. That's the way he talked about it, planning the peace. During the war, he sometimes referred to America and its allies in the war as the United Nations. He didn't live to see his design of the United Nations come true. But when the United Nations was organized after World War II, it was basically the Franklin Roosevelt design. And every day at the United Nations throughout its history, the American president's ambassador to the United Nations always stood on the side of freedom. The United States of America in the United Nations voted with the free nations of the world against the cruelest dictatorships in the world, which almost always meant voting against the Soviet Union. In the 21st century, as Russian President Vladimir Putin began turning the Russian government into a dictatorship again, the United States leadership of the free world at the United Nations meant standing against Russian aggression. Since Russia invaded Ukraine exactly 3 years ago on this day, the United Nations passed 6 resolutions against the Russian attack on Ukraine. And the United States voted with the free world against the Russian war on Ukraine every single time until today. The United Nations once again today approved a resolution condemning Russia's war against Ukraine, and for the first time in history, the United States did not stand on the side of freedom in the United Nations. The United States, for the first time in history, voted with the dictator against the free world. Donald Trump voted with Vladimir Putin in the United Nations, and so it's official. It really is. As of today, if there's a leader of the free world, it is not the President of the United States. It might be the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who played an important role in presidential history today, making Donald Trump the first president in history who had to be interrupted and corrected by an ally when the President of the United States was lying, and lying about that ally. General Charles de Gaulle, who became the President of France after World War II, may have been the most egotistical elected president anywhere in the world. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt couldn't stand de Gaulle during World War II. But they knew they had to deal with him, and they never had public disagreements with General Charles de Gaulle. Emmanuel Macron may be one of the least egotistical French presidents in history, but today it was the mild-mannered French president who had to interrupt the blustering President of the United States when the President of the United States was lying. And it fell to the French president to correct the American president in a way we have never seen an American president corrected before by another head of state or by anyone. Donald Trump did his standard lie about Europe's aid to Ukraine, the lie that Europe has loaned money to Ukraine, and it's a loan, and Ukraine has to pay it back. Donald Trump became the first American president in history fully humiliated on the world stage by instantly getting caught and corrected in his lie.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear,
Okay.
We have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia will have paid for that.
If you
This is my
believe
wish.
that, it's okay with me. But they get their money back, and we don't, and now we do. But, you know, that's
We will
only
fight.
fair.
He actually reached out, President of France reached out, grabbed the arm of the American president to stop him from telling a lie about France and the rest of the countries of Europe. So Donald Trump's response to being corrected on his lie was to simply tell the lie again. They get their money back. When President Macron finished speaking, Donald Trump just told the lie again. So on the day when Donald Trump officially sinks the presidency on the international stage lower than it has ever been, by not only surrendering leadership of the free world at the United Nations, but standing against the free world, then right there in the Oval Office, Donald Trump is humiliated and exposed in a way that no previous president ever could be, because no previous president would be pathological enough to try to tell a lie like that right in front of the person he's lying about. And no previous president could possibly be stupid enough to try to tell a lie like that. But as our first guest tonight has written, quote, "The divide in politics today is between unreality and reality." Yale professor Timothy Snyder wrote that. Donald Trump constantly represents unreality. His followers constantly prove they share that same unreality with Donald Trump. They are unreachable by reality. They are unreachable by the reality presented today by the French president. Trump's followers will never see what the French president did to Donald Trump in the Oval Office today. And if they did see it, they wouldn't understand it. And Donald Trump knows that. which is why, after the French president catches him in a lie, Donald Trump just tells the lie again. President Macron tried to break through to Trump followers by appearing on Fox at the end of the day.
Today is clearly the anniversary of the beginning of the aggression war of Russia in Ukraine. They invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. We want peace. And I think the initiative of President Trump is a very positive one. But my message was to say, be careful, because we need something substantial for Ukraine, but for the security of Europe and France. And second, let's work together on the future to preserve security guarantees, meaning to be sure that this peace will be respected by Russia.
The now powerless Republican senior senator Mitch McConnell, who, when he was in the Senate leadership, enabled Donald Trump in every way that he possibly could, issued a statement today saying refusing to acknowledge Russia as the undeniable and unprovoked aggressor is more than an unseemly moral equivalency. It reflects a gross misunderstanding of the nature of negotiations and leverage. Blame for this human catastrophe rests solely on Vladimir Putin. Here's how we know. If Russian forces laid down their arms, Europe would be at peace. If Ukrainian forces laid down theirs, Putin's aims would not stop with Kyiv. Mistaking this fact is as embarrassing as it is costly. Without a clear and resolute commitment to the leadership and order that underpins our prosperity and security, America's adversaries will receive exactly what they hope for. There is no question. The entire world is watching. Speaking of embarrassing, in the joint press conference with President Macron, Donald Trump was asked about his threatened tariffs against Canada and Mexico.
The tariffs are going forward on time, on schedule. This is an abuse that took place for many, many years. And I'm not even blaming the other countries that did this. I blame our leadership for allowing it to happen. I mean, you know, who can blame them if they made these great deals with the United States, took advantage of the United States on manufacturing, on just about everything. Every aspect that you could imagine they took advantage of. I look at some of these agreements, I'd read them at night, and I'd say, who would ever sign a thing like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Who would sign something so bad for America? I think the control room actually has a picture of who signed it. Let's see. Yeah, there he is. That's the guy who signed the current trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. He did it the first time he was president. And I think we've got him holding up. Yeah, there he is holding up his very proud signature. Look at how proud he is of that signature on what he called then the greatest trade deal in history.
For the first time in American history, we have replaced a disastrous trade deal that rewarded outsourcing with a truly fair and reciprocal trade deal that will keep jobs, wealth, and growth right here in America. And in a true sense, it's also a partnership with Mexico and Canada and ourselves against the world. It's really a trade partnership, if you look at it that way. And it's a day of great celebration in all three countries.
Great celebration in all three countries. The perfect trade deal. Canada, Mexico, and the United States, all three countries. And nothing changed between that day and today. The Biden administration did not change one word of the Donald Trump signed trade agreement with Canada and Mexico. So imagine an elderly president who says, who would ever sign anything like this? And then you produce the pictures of him signing it. Wouldn't the Washington press corps just scream about the cognitive decline of that president? Wouldn't the White House press corps ask screaming questions about the president's mental capacity? Two presidents shamed and embarrassed Donald Trump today. The first was the president of France. The second was the president of the United States. Today, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, said this. This war has deep meaning. It is a fight for independence, the kind that many nations have gone through. Those who fight survive. Those who surrender are erased by history. And we, Ukrainians, exist. And we always will.
Just days after Donald Trump swore in a conspiracy-peddling far-right commentator with no relevant experience as the director of the FBI, he announced that he would be making Dan Bongino, a conspiracy-peddling far-right commentator with no relevant experience, see a theme here, as the deputy director of the FBI. Now, it's important to note that in the Bureau's 117-year history, the FBI's second in command has always been a career agent with the kind of institutional knowledge necessary to actually run the Bureau's operations, which makes total sense. The last full-time deputy director, Paul Abate, had logged 25 years with the Bureau before being appointed to the position. Before him, Deputy Director David Bowditch had 23 years at the Bureau under his belt. Before him, Deputy Director Andrew McCabe had 20 years of experience. And before him, Deputy Director Mark Giuliano with 25 years of experience in the job. That's what he came in with. So between the previous 4 deputy directors, that's almost 100 years of experience at the FBI. I'm not a mathematician, but that's a lot of years. Now, Dan Bongino's resume, on the other hand, includes 2 years working for the New York Police Department, 12 years in the Secret Service, 3 unsuccessful runs as a Republican candidate for office, and about a decade as a far-right MAGA pundit.
My entire life right now is about owning the libs. That's it.
The FBI is lost. It's broken. Irredeemably corrupt at this point.
Jack Smith, of course, the special tyrant investigating Donald Trump for a fake crime he made up for a fake insurrection. The only thing that matters is what? Chad. What matters? Anyone? Power. Power. You can see what I'm out. Power.
Seems like a nice guy. Now, joining me now is NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian and conservative attorney George Conway. Okay, Ken, let me just start a little bit with the history here, because I mentioned the deputy directors and the history of how many years experience they typically have. That's something it seemed that Kash Patel promised or said publicly he might continue. So what happened here?
At least according to the FBI Agents Association, they say that Patel committed to them that he was hoping to and interested in hiring a career FBI agent, as has always been the case in this job. And when you think about it, that would make sense. He's an outsider.
Yeah.
He's a flame-throwing MAGA partisan outsider. You need somebody in there that knows how to make the trains run on time. This is an incredibly powerful job. Some people were telling me today they think the deputy job is more important than the director job, because the deputy actually supervises operations, is in charge of all the special agents, in charge of all the field offices across the country, has his hands on some of the most sensitive intelligence and counterintelligence operations in the United States. And this is now being handed to a guy with no experience in the FBI and a long experience trashing the FBI.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, just double. The deputies in many of these agencies are actually the ones who run the day-to-day, thousands and tens of thousands of employees. They do a lot of the work. No offense to the people at the top. George, let me ask, today, Trump's post announcing Bongino, he added to his resume that he's one, I'm just going to get this quote for you. You're going to love it. You probably saw it. One of the most successful podcasters in the country. What do you make of this pick?
Well, it's got nothing to do with actually running the FBI as a law enforcement agency. It has to do with owning the libs. I think there's a little bit of that with Donald Trump. He hates the FBI. The FBI investigated him for his various crimes, including the Mar-a-Lago stolen documents case, which was an open and shut case. But yet, Dan Bongino said that everybody associated with that case should be fired. Mm-hmm. And so it's really about revenge. It's about owning his enemies. And also it's about retribution. I mean, he really does, Donald Trump. It's just ingrained in him. He wants retribution against his enemies. And by picking 2 people who are completely loyal to him and who have spread his disinformation about January 6th and about Spygate, even back in 2016, that's what Bongino got on the radar screen for, and COVID, which Bongino got thrown off of YouTube for permanently. I mean, all this stuff, it's just these are the 2 perfect people to run an FBI that's controlled by a president who's a criminal.
Let me ask you, Ken, I mean, you are so well-sourced within the FBI. I assume, but you tell me, that after Kash Patel was nominated and confirmed, there was this hope that they'd have somebody who was one of their own, right? as the deputy, that who could run things and help maybe serve as a protective layer? What has the reaction been?
It's been shock and horror, because you're absolutely right. They thought, look, as controversial as Kash Patel is, if you put a career agent in there as the deputy, then he can explain, no, sir, that's illegal. We can't do it that way. We have to follow the rules and the law. Now you have two bomb-throwing MAGA outsiders. And look, here are some of the things that Dan Bongino has said. Dan Bongino said that the FBI lied a few months ago when they said, we don't know who the suspect is that planted the bombs outside the RNC and the DNC the day before January 6th. They had this whole campaign seeking information from the public. Dan Bongino went on a podcast and said, oh, that's wrong. They know who did it. It's a conspiracy. Now he's going inside to run the place. And that's what I'm hearing today is just horrifying people who work there.
I mean, I can't. Some of these people have been there for decades. Let me ask you, George, one of the questions I get asked a lot, I mean, just when you're in a train station, is like, what are the guardrails? What can be done to stop this? I mean, I think there are a lot of people who might be on a political enemies list, who might be targeted, just who are concerned about what they could do with their power. What are the legal guardrails here to stop the two of them from...
Well, I mean, the legal guardrails ultimately would be the courts.
Yeah.
Because if they want to bring punitive prosecutions against people, they still have to prove crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. But at the end of the day, in terms of just the mismanagement of the agency, I mean, 38,000 people work for this agency, and the two people at the top don't know anything about how it works. And they've lost a number of people at the top levels already. So it's just, I don't know what the remedy is other than we're stuck with them, and it's not great.
I would say one thing though, another guardrail are the people that work there that will follow the rules and the law. This is a rule-based organization. They're not going to just start investigating people without predication. They will quit, many of them, before they do that, and so we'll find out about it.
But the problem is, who are they going to hire to replace these people? It could be, these January 6ers.
This is a real possibility. I know you both know these issues so well. Ken, you're the hardest working person covering this agency. Thank you. George, thank you so much. We'll talk more about this, unfortunately, soon, I bet. I hope.
My concern right now, and I think I speak for a lot of Americans, is Elon Musk.
Yes. How can we be represented by you if you don't have a voice in Congress?
I'm a registered Republican voter and retired active Army officer. How can you tell me that DOGE, with some college whiz kids from a computer terminal in Washington, D.C., without even getting out into the field, after about a week or maybe two, has determined that it's okay to cut veterans' benefits?
When are you going to wrest control as the Congress back from the executive and stop hurting your constituents?
Are you willing to use your subpoena power to say, Musk, come in here, stand in front of Congress, and answer some hard questions?
When will you stand up to them and say that is enough?
We could have gone on and on. That was just a sampling of what's happening. You know what? We should go on and on. Let me do some more. This is sound from Wisconsin.
I saw you on TV.
We're going to pull up more. There is more of that. And the point is, you don't have to look very far. Here it is. Here's what's happening in Wisconsin.
President Trump has issued a lot of executive orders. I think by and large this is moving very quickly compared to other administrations, and I think across the board he's done some very good things. I think he's gotten rid of birthright citizenship.
Illegal as hell.
Boos from Republicans for Republicans. And as I said, there's more. Republicans in Congress are right now facing voters in their own party and Democrats and independents who are very angry when they go home to their neighborhoods and communities and home districts. It comes after Elon Musk's slashing of the federal government programs and workforce, imperiling jobs and programs, and in some cases subsidies that their constituents have come to rely on, and rapidly intensifying and concentrating all of the power in America's system of government inside the Oval Office. The New York Times is reporting that one constituent of Texas Republican Congressman Pete Sessions cautioned him at a recent town hall by saying this, quote, "I like what you're saying, but you need to tell more people. The guy in South Africa is not doing you any good. He is hurting you more than he's helping you," he added, referring to Musk. Trump on Friday was asked about the bubbling grassroots outrage over Trump and Musk's policies. Here's what he had to say.
Some members of Congress in red districts are facing pushback from voters in town halls. They don't like the work of Elon Musk and these other actions. What do you say to them?
Who do you work for?
I work for ABC News, sir.
No wonder. Let me just tell you that I have today the highest poll numbers I've ever had. I have today the highest poll numbers of any Republican president ever.
Trump to Republican voters, eat it. Joining our conversation, MSNBC columnist, author of the newsletter To the Contrary, Charlie Sykes. Also joining me at the table, distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, MSNBC political analyst Eddie Glaude. Charlie Sykes, it has not just echoes of the Tea Party, but all the makings of a movement that is grassroots. And once it burns completely out of control of any Republican leaders.
I was thinking the exact same thing. That scene you had from Glenn Grothman's town hall meeting was interesting because Glenn represents a very Republican district, and I can tell you that those scenes are not typical. That's not the kind of reception he's used to getting. But also, he's been around in politics enough to remember back in 2009 when, in fact, the first bubbling up of the Tea Party was in town hall meetings like this. And I think that what you're going to see is although initially you're going to have a lot of focus on Elon Musk, if Republicans in Congress move ahead with some of the budget cuts that they are talking about, I think you're going to see this spread rather dramatically because right now, over the last month, this has been a Washington-based story, and it's about to become a district-level story all across the country. And again, Republican politicians recognize a grassroots movement because they benefited from it in 2009, and it's got to be kind of a strange mirror image watching it turn on them right now.
What's amazing is that this can't be confused with what I think people have been thinking the resistance of Trump's presidency is going to look like. This wasn't in anyone's script. This can't be manufactured. These are Republicans who understand that Trump has already backtracked on the price of eggs by saying, quote, it's hard to make things go down. This is Trump who has backtracked on economic pain by saying people may suffer in the short term. This is Trump doubling down with helping billionaires like Elon Musk and his cohort. And already after 4 weeks saying, I don't know about those things that you voted me to do.
Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my mind around it, Nicole. I can't quite understand what direction it's going to go, how the politics will play out, because where do these people go?
Right.
Do they not vote for the Republican representative? Do they vote for a MAGA Republican who runs from the right? Do they vote for a Never Trump? I don't know where they land as a political act after this. And, we've been talking about what will be how will the Bannon-Elon Musk fight cash out? And what I was listening for in a lot of these town halls is that it felt like a Bannon critique in some ways.
A little bit, but there's something about there's something about the weakness of it, right? What you hear from them, and again, this to me restores my faith in the ability of information to flow in and out of the silos. And I'm not saying they believe me. I'm not saying these voters are going to turn on MSNBC and take my word for it. But they see Republicans as abdicating their roles. Right. They see them, and they'll render their own judgments. And I agree with you, because these are people that do want people in this country illegally who commit violent crimes deported, right? These are people who do not, they are cheering the executive orders banning trans kids from sports, right? These are not necessarily Harris Biden voters, but they are people who are angry enough at Trump to show up and yell at their Republican members of Congress.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I think that there's a Bannon strand, right? And then there are folks who are actually kind of calculating the human cost
Yeah.
Right? That folks, this is not just like a layoff in a particular town. You know, what's happening in Georgia, that's the CDC. 750 probationary workers have been laid off. So it has a local impact. But what I'm trying to think through, though, Nicole, is what does it look like? They supported the deconstruction of the administrative state. I mean, what did they think
that hit their district?
Yeah, so then it turns to, oh, they're selfish. Yeah. So I'm okay with it as long as it happens to them. But once it happens to me and mine, all hell breaks loose. What are you doing? You're hurting us. And so I'm trying to figure out, going back to my first point, I don't know how it cashes out politically, because elements of it seem to be part of the problem.
I want to bring in my pals, Rachel Maddow, Nicole Wallace, and Lawrence O'Donnell. It's exactly like the specials, except I can't ask Maddow for cocktail tips when she's trying to write 8,000 words of copy. And I'm like, well, can't you just tell me one thing about the cocktails? No, I have to write this copy. Thank you all for being here. Let's talk about this, because I wanted you guys to be here with me, because you are my comrades in arms in covering this insane moment that we're in when it comes to what is happening in our country. I want to start with you, Rachel. I would love for you to give our audience just your take, your tips. What do you think people can be doing right now that's effective?
Well, first I want to say that I love you, Joy.
I love you.
And that I am bereft that the readout is ending. I just can't even, I sort of can't get beyond that. So I want to say that, but that is also part of what I think I have to say to the country about this moment, which is find people who you respect and trust and love and make common cause with them and help yourself by learning from them and help them by standing up for them. And I think we have tried to do that. And I think that in important ways we have failed, but I think it's still the right thing to try to do. And so whether that means, joining something locally, or whether that means making some sort of more unofficial common cause with the people in your life who you respect and who you think are people you can depend on, like I feel about you, you got to join forces. We can, none of us can do this alone. And being atomized and dislocated and picked off one by one is a strategy of the other side, and we need to stick together.
Indeed. And when you're hearing Rachel say that, know that no one fights for us harder in this company than Rachel Maddow. And when I tell you she is our fearless leader, we mean it. And she is our super friend. We love her so much. And let me go to my other, speaking of super friends, when y'all watch on the special, the person that says exactly what I was going to say, making me have to think of a whole different thing to say, because she thinks she's like so brilliant, but I'm just literally so in awe of just your history, your ability, your political acumen. Nicole Wallace, my good sister, tell me what you, in your brilliant self, believe people can do.
Well, I'm going to break the rules the way Rachel broke the rules and tell you that I love you, that the happiest times I've had, not just at MSNBC, but ever being on television, have been sitting next to the two of you. No offense, Lawrence. We love having you there, too.
We love Lawrence.
And that I think that I thought that things like that on TV couldn't be real, but that the friendships that have sustained me have been with both of you. And I am, it's like losing a limb, the thought of doing those nights without you. Your strength and your fearlessness is the answer to the question I think you're getting at with both of us. And I think that my reaction to the end of the readout and your departure is despair. And the only thing that chips away at that for me is that despair is the autocrat's tool. It's their most effective weapon. It costs nothing. It's easy to deploy. It's contagious. And then it puts in motion all the actions they want: hopelessness, isolation, exasperation, giving up. Yeah. And so the only reason I will not wallow in what I feel about you leaving is because I think that's what they want. And so I don't think there can be artificial joy and gaslighting about sort of breaking up the pro-democracy side. I think it has to be, I think we have to be real with ourselves and with each other. But I do think I'm so intrigued and sort of I feel the stirrings in everything you've been covering tonight. You know, the answer to this moment is not going to come from a perfect ad being cut by a brilliant ad maker and put on the air for the perfect candidate that comes out of a lab. It's just, that's not how we're going to save ourselves. And I think waiting for someone to save us is kind of how we got here. We have to save ourselves. We as a country have to decide that Elon Musk getting, you know, I mean, I don't even know what the word is. He's already the richest person in the world, you know, richer than the richest person, you know, to ever exist. I don't even know what the goal is. But I think that turning this over to the country and saying, you may think this is what you wanted, but this is not who we are.
Yeah, indeed. And I think people are getting there. And Lawrence, I want to bring you in because, and again, I keep going back to the special because, like, literally it's like a little party. We're like a girl group, but we let one guy or two hang around. Hayes gets to hang around, but we love our Lawrence. Lawrence is literally the guy that we're all sitting there waiting. What in the world is Lawrence going to say? Because we're going to be like, that's it. We got it. We understand it. So do that for us now, Lawrence. Just solve all of these democracy problems for us now. 3, 2, 1, go.
Well, this is the greatest honor lineup I've ever been in. So let me just start with that. An honor to be in this lineup. And Joy, I'm going to skip the love stuff because we did that on Saturday.
It's true.
You know, I put it in writing in that first text when I said I love you. Okay, so you have that. And writing's forever, so you have it. So,
y'all don't realize we literally text and call each other. Like, it's really wild. But anyway, please, Lawrence, please continue.
So I want to turn to this wonderful book by Joy-Ann Reid, Medgar and Murley. No, seriously, this is important, and it's to the answer of what we're talking about here, because you know, right in the middle of it, on page 194, there is this. This is the decisive battleground for America. Now, that really feels like something someone said 5 minutes ago or any time in this year. That's 1964. That's a 24-year-old guy named Michael Schwerner who is going to be murdered that year after he says that, because he has decided in 1964 that what he's going to do is leave the safety of his home in the North and go to Mississippi, the most dangerous place in America, and go down there as a civil rights worker trying to help people register to vote. That was his choice. There were other people who couldn't do that, people his age, who never leaving their neighborhoods or their towns in the North and elsewhere around the country, tried to fight the same fight, tried to do what they could do. There were people who decided that what they would do is vote, that they were on the side of the righteous, but all they could do is vote. But every one of those people made some kind of decision in the face of something that was hopeless. It looked hopeless in 1964. It looked in 1964 that if you think you're going to work to get black people the right to vote in Mississippi, you are going to be dead and no one's going to get the right to vote. And in the end, he won. He won in death. He won from the grave. And that choice is there for everybody all the time. And there's another thing that comes to mind, Joy, and I'll shut up, and that is Walter Lippmann, when he went to his 30th Harvard class anniversary, which I know is a distant thing for you. Your Harvard class, your 30th reunion isn't coming for a long time. But Lippmann said to his Harvard class in 1940, you know, before the United States is into World War II, but World War II is underway, that they now had no choice. There was no choice. They couldn't take anything for granted. They had to join this fight against fascism. They had to join it because there was no way you could sit back and choose to do nothing. He didn't tell them what to do. He didn't say you should join the army or anything. He just said, you absolutely must now be committed with every bit of strength you have, again, against something that seemed hopeless. I mean, Germany was just raging across Europe then. Mm-hmm. It looks like there was going to be a winner, and it was going to be Hitler. And so these dark hours have demanded things of people that they have risen to in the past, and there's no reason why people can't find their own spot. Michael Schwerner didn't join a political campaign. He didn't need a leader to tell him what to do. He just did it. He just got on that bus and he went to Mississippi. He just did it. And everyone can just do it.
Yeah, amen. And Rachel, I mean, that is so powerful because, I like to steal good ideas and I give people credit for them, but you're the one who said history is here to help. I mean, it just actually is, and you and I are both obsessed with the 1920s and 30s. I'm very obsessed with them, and the 20s especially now because it feels very resonant to today. But I think part of the thing of history is it kind of makes people feel a little dejected because we keep repeating it. And so I think the question is, what is the thing that puts a pin in history so that we don't? So I wonder how we use that history, that brilliant history we just heard from Lawrence, but not let that make us feel like, what's the point? Because we're just going to do it again.
Well, it cuts both ways, right? Because the severity of what our predecessors have been up against in the past can be disheartening because you can think, like, why does this stuff keep coming back? Why do we never defeat these things? But the other way to look at it is to think, wow, our predecessors have a lot to teach us about how to defeat these things, about how to defeat, one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot in the past year or two, Joy, is the way that we defeated the fascist movement here in the United States that wanted us not only not to join World War II, but if we were going to join on the side of the Nazis. We've talked a lot, you and I, especially around your book, Medgar and Murley, we've talked about the strategy and the human strength that it took to build a movement to defeat segregationism. And that itself was a movement. That was a minority movement that was fascistic in nature, and that absolutely succeeded in ruling whole parts of the country until it was defeated by an equal by a larger and smarter movement that took it down. The people who went before us in this country, who have defeated forces that were a lot more impressive than what we're up against right now, have stories to tell us about what to do. And that's why you are interested in history. That's why we've all been covering so much history on all of our shows. It's not just because the bad guys recur, it's because the good guys, who are never as famous as the bad guys.
Amen.
The good guys, they have stories to tell us about what to do, and we need to stay loud. We need to stay united. We need to protect the press. We need to protect the institutions that we've still got as they are under assault right now. But it starts with joining something. It starts with finding people who you believe in, who inspire you, and who you love and trust. And that can be your colleagues at work, like we have. It can be your local Indivisible group. It can be your local book club. It can be anything. But now is not the time to be alone and scrolling on your phone, or complaining on social media. Now is the time to join something in real life.